Hey, thanks for joining us today. I'm Charles Eckel, work at Cisco in DevNet. I'm an open source developer evangelist there. And co-presenting with me is Pascal Menezes. He's CTO of MEF. And we're here to talk to you today about OpenDaylight. It's a good thing since we're at an OpenDaylight conference. And about how it's used within a reference implementation for next generation network services, and more specifically, next generation network services as they're being defined by MEF. So let's see. Just a brief agenda here. The idea is to start by talking about open source and open standards, in this case more specifically OpenDaylight and MEF as kind of the examples that we'll be talking to. But talk about that subject a little in general as well. Then we'll give you a little bit of background about MEF and the third network. How many of you are familiar with MEF? Okay, so a bit of background there, and some, we'll go into a bit of details too about the third network. Then the LSO hackathons, that's something that actually I've been involved with. That's what got me involved with MEF, is bringing those into play and how we're using those to bring open source and standards together. And then we'll have a summary. And in terms of questions, interrupt us at any time. We have a good amount of time, so we'll take questions at the end, but bring them up as they come. Okay, so first open source and open standards. So my background, I've been active in the IETF for a long time, and more recently active in MEF. And so my perspective is coming a little bit from those two organizations and primarily from IETF. But I think what I'm going to say, probably applies to most standards groups. And at least for IETF, historically and continues today to provide some very valuable standards, really serving as the backbone of the internet and the basis of interoperability. And so some key stuff there. And the way it works is these standards get formed, and it could take a couple years for the time you start working on something to the time you actually have a standard. And then, traditionally vendors will go off and implement it, write hardware, you'll build hardware, software that conforms to those standards. And then they get put into service, and it actually takes a couple more years then for interoperability to really be achieved. And that's because, these standards are written by people like us. They're subject to interpretation, they're complex. When different vendors go and implement them, there's some ambiguities or some assumptions they make regarding what they read. And so when you plug these things together, they don't necessarily work just out of the box. So you put that all together, and it's a pretty long cycle from the time you start working on a standard to the time you actually have interoperable solutions based on that standard. And I think what we're all seeing here, and OpenDaylight is a good example of it, is there is a new world order, and open source is coming in and it's dominating the internet, it's dominating a lot of different industries. It's really facilitating big change in networking and in cloud and IoT and everything, which is cool since we're all here at an open source conference. So I assume you all really care a lot about open source as well. So it's fantastic. Innovation's happening very fast, but at least my point of view is there still is a need and a value that's provided by standards. And it's still important to have these consensus-based standards, but what's changing is we can't afford to wait for them as long as we had in the past. And that's something that open source is really bringing to the forefront. So when you look at open source, I mentioned have logos for a few there that I'm sure you're all familiar with. I already mentioned fueling this industry transformation. And the value of it is really in the community, in people like yourselves, right? And being able to leverage that. And with the vast community that's contributing, you can innovate at a tremendous pace. And sometimes you even end up coming up with a de facto standard, just because so many people adopt and use a certain open source project. So those are some of the positives, but there also is a lot of complexity to open source. And I think you would all agree with me there. I mean, getting OpenDaylight up and running and operational, it's not a trivial thing. Getting OpenStack up and running is not trivial. Putting the two together is not trivial. That's part of why OPNFV was formed, right? It's really as a a system integrator of multiple open source components. And the reasons for that is these open source projects weren't necessarily made to work together, right? And they may each just be solving a part of the problem. So if you want really a full solution, you have to put these things together. And oftentimes there's a lot of work that goes into gluing these pieces together. So the way I see it, these open source projects is really sort of like a tool set that you have to use, but you have to be really good in your craft to be able to put them together correctly. And I think that's an area where the standards can help out as well. So I mentioned both IETF and MEF, and just a brief background on each of them for those of you who may not be super familiar. IETF stands for Internet Engineering Task Force. It was founded actually 30 years ago with the goal of first creating the internet and now really more making the internet work better. And so networking protocols and software is really the main heart of what IETF does. Producing standards, there's no formal membership in IETF and there's no fees. And in that sense, I think it's a little bit unique from maybe what you may think of as a traditional standards organization. When you are a member of the IETF, you're operating as an individual. But multi-vendor operability is key, and that's one of the things that drives the IETF. And then looking at MEF, another standards organization, not around quite as long, but came into being in 2001, really with the goal of carrier Ethernet services and making that a reality, global deployment of that, right, where multiple service providers could interoperate. And it's been a huge success, has over 200 members, now getting into service orchestration, as you'll hear a bit more about. And certification is a big thing there, so that you're actually guaranteed when you put these pieces together that they will interoperate. A little different from IETF in that you do have membership fees and that type of thing there. But multi-carrier interworking is key for them. So you see this interoperability is really a key thing for the standards groups and the people who participate there, and that's a big part of why they do participate. So now, change is coming to those groups because I think they're not oblivious to this problem. They realize that open source is sort of a problem for them, but it's also a great opportunity. And both these organizations are embracing it. And one way in which they're embracing it that I'm very active with is I've brought the hackathon to both of them, to IETF and to MEF, with the idea being, let's not just work on standards, let's work on code that implements those standards, and let's do that in parallel, right? So that we can learn from the implementation, have that feedback into the group that's working on the standards, and kind of iterate over that and get working implementations that interoperate much quicker than when we do that other cycle that I showed at the beginning. And I'll go into more detail on especially the LSO hackathon later on, but just wanted to introduce that concept to you. And with that, I'll turn it over to Pascal to tell you more about MEF and the third network.
Thanks. Thanks, Charles. Thank you for attending. I welcome you. So let me talk a little bit about the MEF. I'm Pascal Menezes, the CTO of the MEF. And really the MEF started in 2001, and it really was, the idea was to take Ethernet, which was in the LAN, and move it into the WAN, which was kind of blasted back then, if you can think about it. And we've been really successful at this in the way that starting, 2001, the idea of carrier Ethernet didn't exist. And now, 16 years later, or 15 years later, we have an $80 billion market. And this $80 billion market is really done based upon the MEF's ability to influence this. And so we have a large carrier base of 130 service providers. And this has really been a blessing for us. And with this, we've taken this $80 billion market and this 130 service providers, and obviously all the vendors involved, and realize that really, what is really the problem? What is today's problem versus what it was in 2001? And we've come up with this new strategy, and we're going to talk about this. The MEF is now involved in a whole new way of looking at the problem that we're faced today in the business side. Specifically, we have the consumer internet, which has been really a powerful, powerful model in that it's allowed this global communication fabric. However, it has no ability to have any kind of guarantees that a business can rely on. And so when we look at this, we go, what is it that the industry want? What does the business customers want, and what does service providers need to get to? And we talk about this in the MEF now as the new work that we're doing to enable this. So I'll talk about these kind of 4 areas. This idea of a third network. What is a third network? I'll talk about this in a second. This idea of lifecycle service orchestration. If you've been hearing a lot about orchestration, it is literally the software that glues everything together, and it's very important. So I will cover that too. The open initiative, as Charles talked about, today's SDOs, these standard organizations, cannot exist in a vacuum from open source. And really, an agile model is working between good specs and good code. And today, you have a lot of open source projects doing really great code, but their documentation and specs are kind of not all there. And yet, you have organizations with SDOs doing a lot of great spec work, but there's no agility between code and spec. And so we'll cover that too. And finally, certification has become really big because at the end of the day, when you think about we all talk a certain language, we want to make sure everybody agrees on that language, and then whoever is participating is certified to talk that language, and that's really what our certification does. And I'll briefly talk about that, but not as important as the first thing. So if you think about it, the internet has been really this huge, huge innovation for society, and it's really allowed us to have a tremendous ubiquity around the world and the footprint. It also has this ability, you just plug in and go. There's no concept of doing any provisioning. You just literally plug in, it gives you an IP address, and you go with DNS. And we really want to replicate that in a business model. And what we found is that we have this $80 billion market of these providers that are today mainly islands that have some physical connectivity between each other. But in order to get a connection up and running with a high quality of today's quality service guarantees and security, which we call today Carrier Ethernet MPLS, the business network, it takes a very long time to make that come alive, and so it does not have agility. So really, how do we get the best of the both worlds? The first generation networks of internet, the second generation of business networks, MPLS Carrier Ethernet. And we call this the third network, which is really a third generation network that has both the agility of the internet and then somewhat of the big what we're trying to get to in the third network, and then also this assurance we get from the business network. So combine that together with the third network, and really within MEF, we have an $80 billion market, and we want to leverage that. So this is very important. So you can see that we have a provider, they offer Carrier Ethernet today, and the idea is how can we interconnect them in a way that has highly agile properties where a customer can go to a portal, set a connection, and automatically dial in the connection, change the bandwidth, get assurance guarantees, and it all happen instantly like they're used to it from the cloud side. So we want a cloud-like structure, yet having the footprint worldwide, interconnecting all these providers. And so we felt with an $80 billion market, we should be able to enable this vision and interconnect them. So you see the idea of lifecycle service orchestration, LSO, having the ability to talk to each other, enable the connection between two providers, and then really at the end of the day, what does that connection look like? It is about the left side, where you have a bunch of eyeballs, whether these business users are mobile or whether they are at their sites, or you saw in the keynote today, business users from Microsoft IT, the idea that a business user should just be able to go anywhere and there's no boundaries anymore. And I kind of agree with that the idea of a network boundary of an enterprise site kind of goes away, it's blurred. So how do you secure that? How do you provide the agility and the assurance guarantees is really critical. So this is really what the left side is saying. And then basically on the right side, we see the ability that cloud is the destination for the business side now. More and more businesses are looking about not only do they get to their data centers, but how do they get to their clouds? Because this is very important. That's where the IT utility is. That's the utility that's manufacturing, handling electricity or whatever it is in IT speak. The idea of supplying all that information is coming from the cloud. So how do we connect the left to the right in this large set of moving parts of the ecosystem of providers is really what third network vision is about. And when you think about that, SDN and NFV are the technologies that we are now embracing to enable this cloud-like agility and these cloud-like services to be come in the service providers. And so when we think about that, what are the new services can we enable than just connecting bandwidth between the left and the right? You know, that's really important because today the service providers are really come from the world of just enabling bandwidth, whether it be wireless or wired. But how can we enable this bandwidth to have intelligence in it? This is a critical part. This is, I think, where NFP is really leading into that in a real great way. We'll talk more about that. So this is the kind of vision, and I'll drill in more in this vision. So in the MEF or MEF, we've got this idea of these new services that we want the service providers to enable. So you see in the left, we have connectivity services, which are, today we have carrier Ethernet services, which is E-line, E-LAN, and so on. But we've embarked on with the MEF this idea of layer 3 services. Now, you'd think, wait a minute, layer 3 has been around forever. Like, what's the problem there? Well, they don't talk a common language. When you are an enterprise customer and you buy layer 3 VPNs from a telco or service provider, you'll get a certain guarantee, a cost of service for a quality of service, and there'll be certain SLAs. And then as they interconnect that to other providers worldwide to get to your final site, your customer site, which could be across the world, there's no guarantees of how they agree upon how those costs of service will talk and how they will map. And so that's an example. And there's no guarantees that the performance of those costs of service are going to be the same, whether it be packet loss, jitter, delay. So these are the kind of issues that are real problematic today. So if you place an order for layer 3 services end-to-end going across the world, unlikely you're going to get this kind of guarantee that's going to match in any way. And if they do, they have to do a special provisioning and take literally months and months and months to make that happen. That's not agility. So this is what we're trying to fix. So having a common language where the customer and the enterprise can agree, and all customer, enterprise, and the service providers can all agree upon is very important. And then, as you can see, the idea of how do you, when we've talked about how do you also provision wavelengths, because now the idea of SDN provisioning, you know, through an abstraction model, provisioning wavelengths, IP services, carrier Ethernet services are important. So that's kind of on the left side. But now that we have NFV, we can also enable the right side, which we can start thinking about security as a service. How does an enterprise who's already outsourced most of its network anyways within the large enterprise to these kind of system integrators, managed providers, service providers, how can they actually go ahead and say, you know, I'm going to secure this connection from the cloud to the internet in a managed offering, much like a utility today when you buy utility from electricity to your house and, you know, sewage and all that. It's the same idea. Can you do it? Can the service provider do all of that and not have to worry about it? Because they have the better expertise. So this is the kind of idea of what we're talking about services. So we've embarked on this journey in the map going from layer 2, moving up the stack. We're doing layer 3 today, and we're embarking in some BOFs or these idea of ad hoc committees to look at security as a service and so on. But what's really important is how do you take that idea of services and instantiate that into real code, into really influencing the open source communities. And so we've implemented these two ideas of OpenLSO, OpenCS. At the end of the day, OpenLSO is nothing more than orchestration. How do we open orchestration up to make sure we agree upon this idea of lifecycle service orchestration, which we'll cover about in a second. And then idea of, if you have orchestration and you want to be able to instantly provision something in an agile way, what do you want to provision? What do you want to turn and control and change in real time? And there are technology domains involved. There are optical, packet, NFV domains, data exchanges, all kinds of these technology domains we'll talk about, and they all have to be orchestrated. So this is the idea of these two areas which I'll drill into. So what you see here is the idea of lifecycle service orchestration. It is something that's very new, and it's got a lot of controversy about what is orchestration. There are different orchestrators. There are orchestrators at the resource level, which we'd be calling NFV orchestrators. There are, packet orchestrators, domain orchestrators, these kind of orchestrators. And then there are these ideas of there's even cloud orchestrators, application orchestrators. But when we talk about lifecycle service orchestration, it's a little different. We're talking about how do we enable an enterprise to be able to talk to this lifecycle service orchestrator and say, give me this service from A to Z, and here's what I want, and dial into the service. And I want to be able to change the service, set policy on the service. I want to be able to see my SLAs on that service. And I want to be able to connect not only to my sites and to users of my business, but also to my cloud services. And really, that's what lifecycle service orchestration is about. So you see on the top right, there's the idea of fulfillment, create the connection, there's control, change the connection, assurance, am I getting what I think I'm getting, analytics, fix it before things break down, and this is kind of things we're working towards as an industry, the idea of, autonomics that can speed up analytics. And then finally, the idea of setting policies that can do time of days or usage, all kinds of various policies. At the end of the day, everything turns into policy. So that's the capability of a lifecycle service orchestration. But more importantly, how does two providers talk to each other? And that's the east-west. You see this idea of sonata in terms of these are these reference points we put in that describe how the east-west communication is going to happen. And if you think about it, this is not different than what we saw in the PSTN world, where in the past we used to have people plugging in the switchboards, trying to make connections happen. It's kind of, today it's all automated with SS7. The idea of LSO between operators communicating that, hey, I want to have a connection, do you have the resources, what's the pricing, I want this kind of policy, can you accommodate, And so the idea is LSO is machines communicating on behalf of the customer is really the name of the game, and that's the east-west side. But in the east-west side, each provider has to talk down to the technology domains and say, can I provision this? Can these technology domains that within my footprint, within my autonomy, can they provide these services? And that's really the idea of the north-south side, which is the LSO Presto, those interfaces that enable that. And finally, the business applications are the higher level functions that say, place a work order, to track a work order, complete the work order, and so on. So these are the ideas of LSO. At the end of the day, it's about enabling an end-to-end service, whether the service be a connection or a security service. It really doesn't matter. It should be, the same ideas involved. So in the MEF, we've taken the idea of this, first LSO, and we've got the specs around this and the service definitions of IP, carry Ethernet, which we've done really a brilliant job at in carry Ethernet. And we've taken that same rigor and now applying it to other new services. That's the left side. And we've defined this LSO in the spec side, which we have a reference architecture, 80 to 100 page long, which describes the reference points and capabilities. And we've also going, and now we want to instantiate, working with organizations like OpenDaylight, OpenO, OpenNV, so on, to instantiate the idea of these reference implementations to make the spec side come alive and show this working for reference implementations that the industry can take and use. And really, that's really what the Open Initiative is about. Charles will talk about our hackathon in more detail. Our MEFnet is really just a platform to house all the bits and these open source ideas and to make all these ideas come alive. And I'm going to go into details now, OpenLSO and OpenCS, as to how do we realize this? How do we work with all these upstream projects to take the spec side and the vision of what we're trying to do here and make that come a reality to actually see that come alive? So I'll skip the certification and go right into the third network services. So really, the idea, you see the idea that services is what we want to realize. The orchestration layer has a set of functions that I've talked about, and they have a set of these APIs to enable them east, west, and north, south. As you can see in the north-south direction, those are the technology domains. Those technology domains are the ones you want to orchestrate within a service provider's network. And those APIs have to be open. And this is the critical part. So if you think of an LSO, if that's closed source by a vendor, ABC, XYZ, Cisco's, NSO, that's okay. But do they have the open APIs to talk to another vendor's LSO, east, west? Do they have the same operational threads and workflow processes that they can understand through those APIs? So that's the important aspect, those APIs. So whether that's open source or closed source, it's a choice. Now, we are working with a lot of open source communities, as you can see all over here. I'll describe this in better as we go on, but closed source is also acceptable as long as those APIs are open. And same at the bottom, you can see at the bottom there's a set of APIs that are open. And at the bottom you see we're working with all these open source projects to realize how do you provision that technology domain to do its stuff, whether it be provisioning VNFs or circuits or connections through packet networks or optical networks or connecting to cloud, to the cloud exchange, or the big thing, SD-WANs. How do we provision an SD-WAN to do its stuff is really the game. And so each of these is going to have a very different take about what's the information going to be passed across those APIs. And that's really what we're working on. So we have these project directors involved that are members that are driving these technology main use cases. And at the end of the day, it's to get to a common open API, working with these open source projects, working with the closed source vendor communities. Once we've got those APIs working, we are in a world where machines can talk to machines in a way and get rid of having people doing that. Because today it takes people and workflow processes and orders and faxes even in order to make that happen. So this is the reality where we are in the market. So this is what the MEFs trying to solve. So as an example of a deployment model, you could see that you have a wide area network connected from a head office, and they want to connect to a cloud. And you can see that they have an optical network and a packet network that's in place today. It's carried around and throw all that stuff away. And they're all physical network functions. And in some cases, you have EMSs that just can't be replaced. And the idea of the LSO will talk to, for example, OpenDaylight controllers, which we have working today with our projects. We have the idea, and we did an announcement with Cisco leading the effort here in the packet network, that they can actually go ahead and provision a connection through the SDN controller, and on the southbound side, use any of the netcom for different kinds of APIs that are involved, or ways of commanding those physical units. But on the north side, between the LSO and the controller, that's the API I'm talking about. That's the one that we're working on. And then again, on the optical transport, we're doing the same thing. And so on. And as you see, as we get to the data center head end, we're seeing the idea of how do you provision the actual NFV, the VNFs environments, and finally, how do we talk to the cloud exchanges, or the cloud itself through an exchange idea. So these are the ideas that we're talking about in an example. So you can see this is a real world deployment of new world meets old world and the brownfield deployment, and this is the reality of what we're trying to do with LSO. So with that, I will pass this back to Charles to talk about how do we make this code come alive in real hackathons with developers innovating on this. And we've done some really great work. So these ideas I've shown so far are not just ideas on paper. We actually have code through hackathons and through our partners enabling some of these solutions. So thank you.
Cool. All right, so yeah, the LSO hackathons. And the idea with the hackathons, it's a series of events. We've had 2. We're going to be having a 3rd one pretty soon. And the whole idea there is, I think Pascal, he was showing you these various projects within MEF, the OpenLSO and OpenCS projects. And there's multiple projects within each of those areas. The idea is to accelerate work on those, right, to help bring people together. Just kind of like what you see here with OpenDaylight, a lot of work happens outside of these conferences, obviously, and outside of the hackathon. But the idea is let's get those people in the room and let's hit on some of the hard problems and let's make some of the connections between the people that we need. The idea there is using the APIs that MEF has defined, let's get them implemented, let's see how they work. Let's provide feedback into the technical committees that's defining those APIs to say, hey, there's some stuff that we need from this API that doesn't exist, or there's this other bit, we don't know what to do with it, right? Let's get that feedback going into it. And then create some open source reference implementations. The whole idea there is if you're defining a standard and now someone's coming and looking at it and reading about it, that's one thing. But if you can actually give them some code where they can get running with it very quickly, that's very valuable too. So that's a big part of what we're doing. The other part is, and I touched on this a little bit already, the collaboration across various SDOs, and you saw this in Pascal's slide too, with TM Forum, with ONF, with IETF. These are other groups that are defining some standards that we want to be able to work with. And then also with the open source community, working with OpenDaylight, with OPNFE, OpenStack, to bring those people in the same room together. Because certainly with MEF, there wasn't a lot of development going on, a lot of development work or developers coming to MEF, not a lot of open source people. So this is a good way to try to facilitate it in an environment that works for both the open source community and for the standards group. And really, we're increasing awareness, and the overall goal being these APIs that are being defined, let's get them supported within, say, OpenDaylight, right? Because now that opens up OpenDaylight as a platform that is usable by, say, all the service providers who are relying on these MEF APIs. Now they don't have to go and build their own proprietary versions or buy a proprietary version from a vendor. They can actually go with the open source project because it has support for it, right? It makes OpenDaylight much more consumable for them. And the key being, contribute this stuff upstream. So as you guys all know, but maybe some people in the standards groups wouldn't be as aware, contributing your code back upstream it's good for you, it's good for others, it's good for the whole project. And so we make sure we drill that principle into everyone. And more running code, whether it be open source, closed source, whatever, as Pascal said, it doesn't have to all be open source. But just having more running code that implements these specs is really the end goal. I'll talk more about it later, but just a preview here. The next hackathon is at the MEF 16 event in November. And yeah, like I said, I'll talk about that more. Now, you actually saw this slide from Pascal, so I won't go into it in too much detail, but what I did want to point out to you is this whole open initiative thing, this part on the right-hand side, that's new, right? And it's a lot of stuff, but a year ago, this didn't exist. So you're seeing big change within MEF. As you heard earlier, MEF has always been great with standards. They even had this Unite project, which had the idea of liaison to other standards organizations, but that was more the traditional method of liaisons where, I don't know if you guys have been involved with these, but you kind of come up and you draft some type of like email type thing in some perhaps official form, then you send it off and you ask for some response back within like 3 months, and then you get that response, and just obviously it doesn't work, right? It's the time frame is not what people want to work on. It doesn't have that rapid response that we're used to in the open source community. So really just radical change within MEF with forming this whole open initiative. And I just wanted to point that out with the hackathon being one important part, but really this whole idea of collaborating with open source is a huge thing. And then providing MEFnet as a place where the projects that we're working on, they're actually running and you can use them. That's important too, right? Kind of providing a sandbox where we can all work together. So now I also want to tell you a bit more about the hackathon because you're probably familiar with hackathons in general. And this hackathon that we're doing is different, I think, than maybe what you're maybe used to. It's a very collaborative type event, right? And sure, it's competitive, but it's a pretty friendly competition because we're all working toward like a common goal of, hey, there's these APIs, we want to get them implemented and vetted, we want to validate that they're usable, and we want to get them implemented and back into upstream contributions, right, into OpenDaylight and other projects. So that's the goal. It's not to stay up for 40 hours and then win some big prize at the end. So maybe that's the bummer, is that you're not going to win huge prize money, but there's other good benefits that come. This exchanging of ideas and getting to know people at a personal level and making those professional network connections is key. Again, because a lot of people in the open source don't know the people in the standards. Maybe they even work at the same company, but they didn't really talk to each other. So we're making those connections. It's open, meaning you don't have to be a MEF member. I did mention before, MEF traditionally, you needed to sign up and be a member, right, to participate. You don't need to do that. And the specs that would have traditionally been only for MEF members to see are now open to you too. So you really see MEF really making a lot of big changes within its overall governance models and everything to accommodate this. And I just wanted to impress that on you because coming from the open source community, it may not be that big a deal to you, but if you've worked in traditional standards groups, I mean, this is really big. So the specs are all made available, and not only is it open to everyone, but there's no fee to participate. Brief history. The first hackathon we had was less than a year ago. It was in November, just last year. And you heard about the different APIs that are a part of this overall LSO architecture. So this picture is kind of a view of the LSO architecture. Each of the arrows you see is labeled as the different APIs that MEF is defining. In this first one, we didn't try to do the whole architecture. We really focused on, I hope by highlighting it that it's not too dark, but the Presto interface. And Presto is really from the service orchestrator to what in MEF speak is the infrastructure control management. And that's like typically where an SDN controller like OpenDaylight would reside. And so we were really focused on that. Of course, you could work on other things, but that was the main focus of that first hackathon. Then with the second one, which was the Euro16 Hackathon, that was in April of this year, we added this Sonata interface. And this was really how one service provider would talk to another service provider when they're trying to turn up a service for a customer where they didn't have the network footprint really to go end to end. And now the service providers want to be able to cooperate. That's what this API is for. And we thought it was important to bring that one into play pretty early on. So that was something we added into the hackathon and try to bring the service providers in, working with the vendors of the network equipment and also the open source community. Again, this collaboration is a huge thing that we're trying to do with the hackathon. And now for this next one that's coming up at MEF 16, that's November this year, we're expanding the focus even more to cover the Legato interface. And that's really the northbound interface that an orchestrator would be exposing to OSS business, OSS and BSS, or to business apps that are running on board, and say a service provider's app that's going to be responsible for establishing these services that a customer may have requested. Within OpenDaylight, there's a project that got spun up specifically to address the APIs that are relevant to OpenDaylight that are being defined within MEF. And that project is the User Network Interface, or the short form Uni Manager project. So that project was started and first introduced in the Beryllium release and had support for what was a very early form of the Presto API. And there's work going on in it now, and it was some advancements done for the Boron release, supporting both the Legato API and the Presto API. And again, just two kind of interfaces that are applicable to OpenDaylight that have been defined by MEF, and adding support for both of them into OpenDaylight. And mention a few of the companies there that have been participating actively on it. And there's a link to the main project page within OpenDaylight. And just to show you where it fits into the big picture, really the main interfaces we're using northbound are RESTconf and NetConf. The Uni Manager, it's one of these enhanced network services. And then southbound, OVSDB and NetConf are the two main protocols supported within OpenDaylight that we're using, and also some vendor-specific plugins where maybe they don't have support for NetConf yet, but they have support for CLI, and they can do a plugin to map it. So that way, we can communicate and have OpenDaylight, when you talk to it from the northbound using these APIs, configure the underlying network to make it a reality. So the OpenCS Packet WAN project. This is one of the OpenCS projects, and there are several others, but this one I just wanted to highlight because this one is specifically using OpenDaylight and adding support for the Presto API into OpenDaylight. And the idea, as I mentioned on the previous slide, RESTconf and NetConf northbound, and then having this idea of a framework for what we call activation drivers, a generic framework for that. And that really comes into play when, again, different vendors have equipment that they want to be able to plug in on the southbound side to provide the network, and they want to be able to just write this driver that makes makes it work so that when you configure something northbound using Presto or Legato, that the right thing can happen southbound to enable the CE 2.0 services that MEF has defined. That's what these activation drivers are going to do, and provide a generic framework for doing that so that different vendors can write their own plugins for that. So at the Euro16 Hackathon, I just wanted to call out, these were really the goals of it was, okay, hey, we have this Presto API, let's add support for it to UniManager. And the API at that point, it was basically based on this model, this NRP model. The NRP model is actually a UML model, and it's a UML model that was based on a UML model that was defined by ONF, the ONF core model. So using that ONF core model as the basis then for defining the Presto API. And the idea was, okay, well, we have this UML model, but OpenDaylight works with Yang models, right? So let's use this UMI to Yang tool that was created as part of the ONF Eagle project, and let's use that to convert the UML into Yang, and then we can feed the Yang model, right, into OpenDaylight, have it generate code, and expose Presto northbound, right? That's really the idea there. So we did that. That was contributed back into OpenDaylight, and just wanted to share with you some of the lessons learned, because we did get something working, but it wasn't quite as straightforward as you may have thought from the previous description. We encountered issues with the NRP model and issues with the ONF core model from which it was derived. Now, this isn't disastrous, but again, that's the idea, right? We want to spot problems early. We also found problems with the tool. And what was happening was these UML models, when we tried to generate Yang models from them, they weren't really usable to feed into OpenDaylight. So we had to kind of hand tailor those generated models. Then when we bring those into OpenDaylight, we had to actually do some hand development of the code as well within OpenDaylight. So there was something contributed into OpenDaylight for the UniManager, but it wasn't nearly as clean as we would like. And it's not something that we could just iterate on very easily as, say, these models evolve over time. So the good thing about that was we could feed that back into ONF, feed that back into MEF, and say, hey, there's some problems we're running into here, right? This whole idea of generating Yang models from UML models and generating code, it's not quite as smooth as we would hope. And that's allowing us to change course and do something better for the future, right? Better to learn, fail quick and then do something different. And if you're interested in getting more of the details, not just of this project, but of all the other projects, there's a blog post you can check out. And then I want to invite all of you to come and join us at the next hackathon. And the next one, it's part of MEF 16. MEF 16 is MEF's big annual conference where it's a bit of a showcase where it's showing off the technology and the solutions that have been built on top of the APIs that MEF has defined. And you'll be able to see how far we've come with realizing this third network and all those services. But more importantly, from my point of view, is the hackathon is happening at the same time. And we'll be doing work with the OpenCS Packet WAN project and other projects. I'll show you that in just a minute. And we would certainly welcome help from the OpenDaylight community and from others to come in and work with us. And so that's November 7th and 9th, 7th to 9th in Baltimore. And we're still accepting registrations. It is limited to, I think, 80 registrations, but we haven't hit that cap yet. So we'd love you to come join us, and some of the sponsors there on the right-hand side. I mentioned the OpenCS Packet WAN project. Basically, we're just continuing the work that we've done. We now have a new Presto API that's being defined, and so we'll be working on that, and we'll be reworking some of the activation framework that was put into place, and hopefully building out some activation drivers for that from different vendors. The other really new thing that we're putting in, and I think Pascal touched on this when he was talking about open LSO projects, this analytics projects that we have, Open LSO Analytics, we want to do some work there and see, hey, there's a lot of great information that OpenDaylight has within it. Let's expose some of that out through the API, through the Presto API, into this analytics project so it can churn on that data, kind of a big data problem, and see what we can come up with in terms of analyzing what's happening. The bandwidth profile, that's also something that we want to work on that we didn't work on in the past, and see if we can get a couple implementations of it. And again, the idea is, let's see, did we nail this bandwidth profile? Is it perfect? Or are there things we need to change about it, right? Let's learn about that by trying to code it up and make our specs better. Another project that people might be interested in, as was mentioned before, not everything at the hackathon has to be closed source. In this case, there's a product from Cisco, NSO, and it supports reading in of Yang models and then exposing the APIs based on those Yang models. So what we're going to do is take the Legato API that has been defined by MEF and bring that into Cisco NSO and have it expose the Legato API northbound to business applications that can use it, right? And we want it to then drive the creation of some services using that API. And the reason why I think it's probably of interest to this community is then we want NSO to talk to OpenDaylight over the Presto API to set up the underlying network. So we're trying to stitch these two projects together using various APIs that MEF is defining. So would welcome help and work on that one as well. Okay, so with that, let me go and wrap things up. So the idea, been drilling into your head, we want to be able to combine open source and open standards, right? And we think there's a lot of value for both communities from that. Take the speed and agility that's in the open source community, and then combine that with the rigor and formality that we get from the standards groups, and make that all happen in a quick cycle. We want more running code happening in parallel with the definition of the standards, right? And that gives us better standards and support for those standards within the open source projects, right? Both of which are very, very key for us. And the call to action, I've already been, selling this idea to you, but come participate with us in the hackathon. Ask questions now at this talk, afterwards when the people you know with who might be involved in this area. Learn about what's out there and always look to reuse and work with someone else. If there's a useful spec that's being defined in some other community, maybe it doesn't look quite perfect for what you need, talk to those people, right? And see, maybe your use case will cause them to change the way they're defining things a bit. And you get some good reuse out of it, just like what you're used to getting with code. Contribute upstream, that is critical. I guess you guys probably all know that. Like I said, that's a big part of the hackathon that we're drilling into everyone contribute back. And the MEF16 hackathon is the one I've really been focusing on today. There is another hackathon. I mentioned the work in the IETF because I work with that community too. And there is work there around Yang models because the IETF's doing a lot of standardization of Yang models, right? And there is some work with OpenDaylight, and we've had work with OPNFV in the past there as well. So that's another opportunity to come and participate in a hackathon where you'll see standards and open source coming together. And that's just a few days after in Seoul. So, or you can do both like I am and get really tired. So that's it. I'm not sure time-wise if we have time for questions, but would be happy to answer any questions you have on the hackathon, on MEF, anything we're trying to do. Yeah?
Yes, first question, do you have any certification program for the API?
Yeah, that's exactly the next generation of, and I skipped by that, I didn't think it would be interesting to developer communities, but definitely there will be a certification coming out on a new certification on those APIs. That's exactly right. And services too. So.
Okay. On the Legato, how much do you use TM for Open?
So I can't, what'd you say?
for legato, how much you use TM forum best? Because I see some people working in TM forum as well, and they said that.
How much do we
TM
use?
forum?
Yes, they,
Oh, TM forum. I'm sorry, I didn't, yeah, we are collaborating together between ONF, TNF, TM forum, and ourselves to build out the information models. They've already got a huge amount of information models. We're working off their information models.
that's information model for the API, and they see that for legato, you want to load the YAN to it, but I don't remember TM forum talk about YAN.
So the current set of Yang models that we have that define the Legato API and that are used with OpenDaylight, those are separate, right, from what TM Forum has defined. But we do have folks from TM Forum who are coming to this hackathon to work with the same people who are defining the Legato APIs and try to work some of that out, because we do see some ability to interwork together. And maybe a lot of what the TM Forum does, we could actually use at the Legato API as well.
Yeah,
so I'd say that's a work in progress.
I think it's really clear that maybe I did mention, we are not trying to reinvent and boil the ocean. We are trying to take whatever's best out there and reuse. For example, TM Forum has done a tremendous job on a lot of good APIs. Where we can prune and refactor off them, we will do that. But they got to be pruned and refactored to our specific use cases. So that's one. Example of open sources. The idea that we're not, even in the hackathons, while we're using code to test ideas, we're hopefully these open source projects are also involved. They will take that and morph that into their own, upstream projects. And because we're not shipping open source code, we're just as a reference implementation. We are working with open source communities to realize this vision. We are not being an open source.
Kind of more like OPNFE, right?
Yes.
Upstream contribution and
Yes.
making the right upstream contribution happen. That's really what we're trying to do as well.
Yeah.
In the hackathon, the previous one, our team worked with Huawei and I'm from NetCracker. Worked with Huawei and Gigaspace.
Oh, yeah.
For that Tosca model for firewall EPL.
Yep.
So what next with it? Because I don't think that's right.
Well, so no one from, as far as I know, no one from Gigaspaces was going to be able to come and continue that work at this hackathon. We're still talking with them, but it didn't look like it was going to fit in their roadmap. The way that did work, too, was over the Presto API. Basically, they were able to use that then to talk to OpenDaylight and offer the service they were doing. In that case, it was sort of like a bump in the wire firewall, right, that was being inserted. Yeah, that's the way that worked. And there were some great learnings that came out of that. They're included in that summary blog post that I had the link to. And my slides the slides from our talk are available online already through the scheduling tool where you sign up for this talk. The slides are there. But that blog post covers some of the learnings that came out of that too, because they found some things that were missing that they needed from the Presto API and the Legato API, and they also did some work with the Sonato API. And because they tried to do the whole end-to-end path and piece a lot of things together, there was great learnings that came out of that. So the work will continue. I just don't think there's anything specifically at this next hackathon in that area, just because people couldn't travel or whatever.
What is the status of the ePort?
So we are working with eCord in the data center use case. We've done announcements on this, and we continue to evolve that. So eCord is working to build those Presto APIs into their projects. Today they have a version of it. It's an older version. They need to get to a newer version that we've released.
And you use ONOS there, right?
Yeah, they're using ONAS.
And XOS.
XOS, yes.
And you implement, you try to adopt API for them.
Today they use the SCA APIs, and we need to move them to the NRP APIs for Presto. Again, Presto is not a API, it's a set of APIs covering all kinds of use cases. In the case of NRP, the network resource provisioning is about provisioning. When we get to analytics, it will show up differently, maybe, looking like it will, as to what we send out as that kind of parts of information on those for that use case.
And multiple implementations by using OpenDaylight, using
Yes.
ONOS, that's a great thing, right? That's exactly what we want. We don't want to like force everyone to one implementation. We want multiple implementations using the same APIs, basically.
Yes.
That's the goal.
In Banking board, would you accept the vendor presentation or contribute demonstration like at the booth? What's the question?
So at MEF 16, you can have vendor-specific stuff in the hackathon, but it's not meant to be like a showcase of here's what my stuff can do. But there is a showcase part of
the show.
Of the show, yeah. They're kind of done hand in hand.
The
But that's
MEF
a separate part.
Yeah, the MEF 16 is a very large conference, about 1,200 to 1,400 people. Many executives from service providers worldwide will be there. Many vendors will be there. And it's a show and tell. And there's a showcase, there's a proof of concept, there's a hackathon, there's the main stage, there's breakout sessions, there's many, many things going on.
Yeah, the hackathon's just the new kid on the block and the part that I'm very excited about. But yeah, the whole conference has been going on and will go on, yeah, with other aspects.
Is there any other questions? If not, we thank you for attending.
Yeah, thank you. Software that conforms to those standards. And then they get put into service, and it actually takes a couple more years then for interoperability to really be achieved. And that's because these standards are written by people like us. They're subject to interpretation. They're complex. When different vendors go and implement them, there's some ambiguities or some assumptions they make regarding what they read. And so when you plug these things together, they don't necessarily work just out of the box. So you put that all together, and it's a pretty long cycle from the time you start working on a standard to the time you actually have interoperable solutions based on that standard. And I think what we're all seeing here, and OpenDaylight is a good example of it, is there is a new world order, and open source is coming in and it's dominating the internet. It's dominating a lot of different industries. It's really facilitating big change in networking and in cloud and IoT and everything, which is cool since we're all here at an open source conference. So I assume you all really care a lot about open source as well. So it's fantastic innovation. That's part of why OPNFV was formed, right? It's really as a system integrator of multiple open source components. And the reasons for that is these open source projects weren't necessarily made to work together, right? And they may each just be solving a part of the problem. So if you want really a full solution, you have to put these things together. And oftentimes there's a lot of work that goes into gluing these pieces together. So the way I see it, these open source projects is really sort of like a tool set that you have to use, but you have to be really good in your craft to be able to put them together correctly. And I think that's an area where the standards can help out as well. So I mentioned both IETF and MEF, and just a brief background on each of them for those of you who may not be super familiar. IETF stands for Internet Engineering Task Force. It was founded actually 30 years ago with the goal of first creating the internet and now really more making the internet work better. And so networking protocols and software is really the main heart of what IETF does. Producing standards, there's no formal membership in IETF and there's no fees. And it's happening very fast. But at least my point of view is there still is a need and a value that's provided by standards. And it's still important to have these consensus-based standards, but what's changing is we can't afford to wait for them as long as we had in the past. And that's something that open source is really bringing to the forefront. So when you look at open source, I mentioned have logos for a few there that I'm sure you are all familiar with. I already mentioned fueling this industry transformation. And the value of it is really in the community, in people like yourselves, right? And being able to leverage that. And with the vast community that's contributing, you can innovate at a tremendous pace. And sometimes you even end up coming up with a de facto standard just because so many people adopt and use a certain open source project. So those are some of the positives, but there also is a lot of complexity to open source. And I think you would all agree with me there. I mean, getting OpenDaylight up and running and operational, it's not a trivial thing. Getting OpenStack up and running is not trivial. Putting the two together is not trivial. So, hey, thanks for joining us today. I'm Charles Eckel, work at Cisco in DevNet. I'm an open source developer evangelist there. And co-presenting with me is Pascal Menezes. He's CTO of MEF. And we're here to talk to you today about OpenDaylight. It's a good thing since we're at an OpenDaylight conference. And about how it's used within a reference implementation for next generation network services, and more specifically, next generation network services as they're being defined by MEF. So let's see. Just a brief agenda here. The idea is to start by talking about open source and open standards, in this case more specifically OpenDaylight and MEF as kind of the examples that we'll be talking to. But talk about that subject a little in general as well. Then we'll give you a little bit of background about MEF and the third network. How many of you are familiar with MEF? Okay, so a bit of background there, and some, we'll go into a bit of details too about the third network. Then the LSO hackathons, that's something that actually I've been involved with. That's what got me involved with MEF, is bringing those into play and how we're using those to bring open source and standards together. And then we'll have a summary. And in terms of questions, interrupt us at any time. We have a good amount of time, so we'll take questions at the end, but bring them up as they come. Okay, so first open source and open standards. So my background, I've been active in the IETF for a long time, and more recently active in MEF. And so my perspective is coming a little bit from those two organizations and primarily from IETF. But I think what I'm going to say probably applies to most standards groups. And at least for IETF, historically and continues today to provide some very valuable standards, really serving as the backbone of the internet and the basis of interoperability. And so some key stuff there. And the way it works is these standards get formed, and it could take a couple years for the time you start working on something to the time you actually have a standard. And then traditionally vendors will go off and implement it, write hardware, you'll build hardware,